The screen is black. A faint sound, fingernails dragging across wood. Then silence. A whisper cuts through, your voice low and commanding. Imagine this. You open an old box sealed away for 100 years. Inside, a single photograph, sepia-toned, the image of a man lying peacefully in his coffin. His eyes closed, his hands folded. At first glance, it looks like every other death portrait of the Victorian age. But look closer. Lean in, because you're not supposed to see this. Around his fingernails are scratches. Not on him, on the coffin itself. Deep enough that he clawed until blood slicked the wood. This man was buried alive. And the signature beneath the photograph? It belonged to his own brother. That man's name was Thomas Copeland. Buried in Millbrook, Massachusetts, in 1861. His brother, Frederick, signed the death certificate, arranged the funeral, and closed the lid. But Frederick was not just a grieving sibling. He was a physician obsessed with forbidden science. He believed he could control the nervous system with poisons, plant alkaloids, belladonna, water hemlock, ergot. He believed he could stop the convulsions of his brother's seizures. But obsession makes men blind. His cure became a coma. His diagnosis became a death sentence. And when Thomas woke inside the coffin, no one heard him, except the photograph, which carried the scratches as testimony. You were never supposed to hear this story. It was hidden, sealed in archives, whispered only in the margins of journals left behind by a doctor who vanished. But now you have heard it, and that means something has shifted. Once you see the truth, you cannot go back. Understand this. Death is not the horror. The true horror is trust betrayed, the living entrusted to the living, and then abandoned. Families burying their own blood, believing them gone, while their muffled screams go unanswered under 6 feet of earth. This is not legend. This is documented, and it is just the surface. Because what happened? They tell you Millbrook, Massachusetts was a quiet town in 1861. White clapboard houses, a church bell tolling every Sunday, neighbors tipping their hats on a dusty main street. That's the surface. That's the illusion. Beneath it, behind lace curtains, in locked cellars, in the closed rooms of doctors and ministers, was the truth. And the Copeland brothers lived at the very heart of it. Frederick Copeland wasn't just another country doctor. He carried with him the kind of ambition that feeds on secrets. Trained at Harvard, touched by the arrogance of Boston's intellectual circles, he came to Millbrook with his brother Thomas, fragile, epileptic, prone to seizures that terrified polite society. Thomas was considered weak, damaged. In a time when men measured themselves by the strength of their labor or the clarity of their sermons, Thomas was a burden. But Frederick didn't see a burden. He saw a subject. The house they lived in still stands, though its windows are shuttered, its foundation rotting. Locals won't step inside. They whisper about the garden, once filled with herbs and flowers, now overgrown and feral. Belladonna, hemlock, foxglove, deadly plants Frederick cultivated with the same tenderness most men reserve for children. He called it medicine. Others might call it poison. Understand this. The Copeland story is not about one man's obsession. It is about a pattern. Throughout history, the sick, the weak, the broken, these are the ones chosen for experiments. Institutions justify it as progress, as advancement for the greater good. But the truth is colder. They prey on those who cannot resist. Thomas trusted his brother. He trusted the hands that mixed his medicines, the voice that whispered reassurance as the convulsions tore through him. That trust would become his coffin. By the winter of 1860, Frederick had already crossed the line. He no longer studied herbs as cures. He studied them as instruments of control. What amount paralyzed muscle? What amount SL? Picture this, a New England winter night, February 1860. Snow presses against the windows of the Copeland house, the lamps burning low in the cellar. And there, beneath the respectable clapboard home on Elm Street, a physician bends over glass vials, powders, and bubbling extracts. This was not medicine anymore. It was ritual. It was transgression dressed in the white coat of science. Frederick's journals from that winter reveal something chilling. Precise measurements, sketches of plants, meticulous records of dosages given to mice, and then to Thomas. At first, Thomas was a willing participant. His seizures had grown violent, his body battered by convulsions that left him unconscious for hours. He trusted his brother's brilliance. He believed the experiments might grant him peace. But slowly, the entries shift in tone. Frederick's calm, clinical notes turn into frantic questions scribbled in the margins. What is life but an electrical storm? Can death be paused? Can a man be preserved on the edge of the grave? This was no longer a healer's curiosity. It was obsession. He began working with belladonna, the beautiful lady, its berries capable of dilating pupils and stopping the heart. Then foxglove, its digitalis affecting rhythm, slowing pulse to a whisper. Hemlock from his swamps outside town, Socrates poison. And worst of all, ergot, a fungus from rye grain, known for centuries to cause madness, visions, even convulsions indistinguishable from demonic possession. Frederick recorded it all, layering these compounds into a mixture he called the suspension. Understand what that means. He was building a drug not to heal but to hold, to pin a man's soul between two worlds, neither fully living nor fully dead. Thomas was his proof, his subject, his sacrifice. Neighbors began to notice. Frederick grew gaunt, sleepless, trembling with the strain of his secret work. Patients whispered about his shaking hands, the smell of strange herbs clinging to his coat. He refused. February 27th, 1861. The Copeland house was silent but for the crackle of the fire and the shallow, ragged breath of Thomas. That day had brought one of his worst seizures yet. His body convulsed until his lips bled from biting down. His muscles locked, his eyes rolled back into white. When it was over, he lay weak, trembling, almost too exhausted to speak. Frederick watched, hollow-eyed, his hands trembling as he mixed the compounds. He had been preparing something new, something he believed would finally conquer the storm in his brother's brain. He called it his final formula. It was not cautious. It was not safe. It was desperation. Water hemlock harvested from the marshes, deadly nightshade from his garden, and ergot, the fungus of madness, ground fine into a powder and dissolved in alcohol. He believed this concoction would paralyze the seizures, still the storms. But the line between paralysis and death is razor thin. That night, he ignored the line. As the church bell tolled 9, Frederick poured the liquid into a small vial. His journal later recorded only one phrase: "Tonight, the cure or the grave." He pressed the vial to Thomas's lips, coaxing him to drink. And Thomas obeyed because he trusted his brother, because he believed in him, because the bond of blood runs deeper than reason. The effect was immediate. The seizure stopped. His muscles relaxed. But then his breath slowed. Slower, slower. His pulse weakened to a faint flutter, almost impossible to detect. His pupils froze wide. His skin drained of warmth. Frederick leaned close, listening for breath, searching for life. There was almost nothing. What would you have done? He could have called for help. He could have confessed. But instead, Frederick doubled down. He applied stimulants. He shocked his brother's chest with crude electrical currents. He pressed hot compresses to his skin. Nothing worked. Nothing brought Thomas back. And as the night deepened into dawn, the truth became unbearable. Millbrook awoke on the morning of February 28th, 1861 to whispers. Thomas Copeland has died. The news spread quickly through the small New England town. Neighbors shook their heads in pity. The young man had been frail all his life, they said. The seizures were brutal, relentless. It was sad but expected. That was the surface. That was the story Frederick needed them to believe. But behind the closed doors of the Copeland house, something darker was unfolding. Frederick had spent the night not grieving, but preparing. He knew Thomas's body did not look right. His skin had a pale, unnatural tone. His limbs were stiff, not with the natural grace of death, but with the rigidity of paralysis. He powdered his brother's face to restore a healthy glow. He bent his arms, repositioned his hands until they folded neatly across his chest. He arranged him as if asleep. And then came the lies. He told neighbors Thomas had suffered a massive seizure in the night. He warned that the body was not fit for viewing. that the trauma of the attack had left his features distorted. In truth, he could not allow anyone to see too closely. He controlled the narrative with the authority of his profession. He was the doctor, the trusted man of science. And they believed him. Why wouldn't they? That afternoon, he began planning the funeral. He insisted it happen quickly, before the weather grew warmer. He insisted on handling all details himself, choosing the pine coffin, arranging the burial plot, refusing help from the local churchwomen. The speed, the secrecy, the closed coffin, these were warning signs. But in a town of 800 souls, grief was familiar. No one suspected deception. They saw only a brother in mourning, a physician struck by tragedy. The service was held on March 2nd. The church was filled. Reverend Hartwell delivered words about suffering and peace, about endurance through trial. Nearly half the town came to pay respects. They spoke of Thomas's kindness, his garden of herbs. It was Reverend Hartwell who suggested it. A photograph, a memorial keepsake. In 1861, this was common. Many families had no image of their loved ones until death forced it. The camera became the final witness, freezing the face of the departed before the earth consumed them. Frederick resisted at first, his voice tense, his body rigid. He feared that the lens might see what the eye could not. But the Reverend's insistence, the expectations of the town, left him no escape. Refusal would have drawn suspicion. So on the morning before the funeral, a traveling photographer arrived. Samuel Morrison, a man who had photographed dozens of the dead across Massachusetts and Vermont. He carried a large format camera, heavy plates, chemicals that burned the nostrils. He was skilled at arranging corpses, straightening limbs, softening shadows, capturing what families wanted to believe: peace. Morrison prepared Thomas in his coffin, folding the hands, arranging flowers, tilting the head slightly. The long exposure required stillness, something the dead offered perfectly. Frederick hovered nearby, tense, his eyes fixed on every detail. Morrison remarked how serene the young man looked, as if sleep had come kindly after years of suffering. But Frederick knew better. He knew the stillness was not peace, but paralysis. He knew the serenity was a mask of poison. The session took nearly an hour. During those long minutes, Frederick studied his brother's face in the dim light. Was there a twitch? A flicker of breath? A ghost of movement beneath the skin? The silence pressed against him like stone. If Thomas was alive, he gave no sign. Or perhaps the drugs had locked him so deep inside himself that no signal could reach the surface. When the photograph was finished, Morrison packed his plates and promised to send the developed image from Boston. Frederick paid him, forced a polite nod, and watched as the photographer's cart disappeared down the road. He must have felt a surge of relief. March 2nd, 1861. The sky hung low and gray over Millbrook, as if the heavens themselves sagged under the weight of what was about to happen. The church bells tolled slow, solemn, each strike echoing through the hills like a countdown. The coffin was carried by 6 men down the narrow aisle, their boots striking wood with each measured step. A simple pine box, acquiesced grave. An ending, or so they thought. The service was crowded. Nearly half the town came to pay their respects. They remembered Thomas as the gentle gardener, the boy who smiled at children even when shaking from seizures, the man who knew every herb by name. They remembered his fragility, his spells, the way Frederick always hovered near, protective, devoted. Few questioned the story. Epilepsy kills, they said. God had simply called him home. But Frederick stood apart. His face was rigid, carved of stone. He gave no tears, no trembling voice. Many praised him for his strength, for holding himself so firm in the wake of tragedy. But they didn't know what it cost him. They didn't hear the silent screaming in his skull, the phantom sound of fingernails dragging inside the coffin. They didn't know that every hymn, every verse of Scripture, was another nail hammered into his conscience. At the graveside, Reverend Hartwell spoke of suffering transfigured into peace. He said Thomas now lay in eternal rest, free of pain, free of fear. And as the shovel struck earth and the first soil scattered across the lid, Frederick closed his eyes and clenched his fists. Perhaps, for a moment, He convinced himself it was over, that the body inside was nothing more than clay, that he had buried not a man, but a mistake. The town went home consoled, murmuring about the fragility of life. Frederick returned to his house, to his cellar, to the silence that pressed harder than the snow against his windows. And yet, something had shifted. Sleep would not come. When it did, dreams seized him. Thomas clawing in darkness, the sew. Frederick unwrapped the parcel with trembling fingers, the brown paper tearing like brittle skin. Inside, the photograph, mounted on stiff card, the black edges framing his brother's eternal sleep. At first glance, it was what everyone expected, a death portrait. Thomas's hands folded neatly, his face serene, the flowers draped across his chest. A quiet remembrance. But Frederick could not look at it as the townsfolk might. His eyes darted, frantic, scanning every detail as if the emulsion might whisper what his ears had failed to hear. He saw the faint tension in his brother's jaw, the unnatural stiffness of the fingers, the pale lips parted just enough to suggest withheld breath. His heart began to race. He leaned closer, tracing the photograph with shaking hands. And then he saw them, near the edges of Thomas's right hand, where it touched the inside wall of the coffin, faint but undeniable, grooves. 3, maybe 4, thin lines pressed into the wood grain. Morrison's lens had captured them, though neither he nor anyone else would have thought twice. But to Frederick, they were unmistakable. Scratches. He recoiled, clutching the photo to his chest, as if it might burn him. The thought crashed through his mind with sickening force. Thomas had been alive when the lid was closed. Alive when the nails were hammered in. Alive when the hymns were sung and the dirt fell. And Frederick, his own brother, had delivered him into that tomb, silenced, paralyzed, entombed in darkness. The room swayed. His medical instruments clinked faintly as his hand brushed the work table. He thought of his notes, his final formula, the journals filled with ambition and desperation. He thought of Thomas's trust, the way his brother's weak hand had lifted the vial, obedient, faithful, believing salvation waited at the bottom. And now this photograph bore witness to betrayal more profound than any sin. He tried to reason with himself. Perhaps the marks were artifacts. Perhaps they were flaw. At first, Frederick kept the photograph hidden. He slipped it between the pages of his journal, shut it away in a drawer, tried to bury it as he had buried Thomas. But objects like that, objects steeped in guilt and death, do not stay buried. 3 nights after its arrival, Frederick awoke to the sound again, scratching. Not faint this time, but sharp, deliberate, rising from the floorboards beneath his bed. He lurched upright, his heart battering his chest. He whispered his brother's name into the dark, though he knew no answer would come. Trembling, he lit a candle, opened the drawer, and pulled out the photograph. And something had changed. The faint lines he had seen before were clearer now, darker, as though freshly cut. Where once there had been 3 grooves, now there were 5. And Thomas's lips, Frederick could have sworn they had parted wider, as if caught mid-breath. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, held the card nearer to the flame. The image remained, fixed, eternal, yet somehow alive. From that night forward, the photograph became his tormentor. By day, it was silent but suffocating, always in his thoughts. By night, it seemed to shift when left alone. Once, returning from the cellar, he found it lying on the table though he had locked it away. Another evening, he swore Thomas's eyelids were not quite shut, that the thinnest sliver of iris glimmered beneath. The townsfolk noticed his unraveling. Patients complained he no longer listened, that his hands trembled too badly to stitch wounds or mix tonics. The grocer saw him muttering to himself in the street. Children whispered that the doctor had gone mad. But none of them knew what waited in his study. None of them knew the photograph had become an oracle of his damnation. By late March, Frederick had stopped practicing medicine altogether. He spent his days in candlelight, staring into the print as though waiting for his brother to speak. And in a way, Thomas did. The scratches multiplied. The hands in. By April, Frederick was scarcely recognizable. His once proud frame had withered to a hunched silhouette, his skin drawn pale as parchment, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He no longer tended to patience, no longer left the house except in darkness. Neighbors whispered of madness, of a grief so profound it had unmoored his mind. But the truth was worse. It was not grief that consumed him, but guilt sharpened into obsession. The photograph ruled him. Every day it seemed to change. The scratches grew deeper, the wood grain behind Thomas's fingers almost splintering through the image itself. The flowers once resting peacefully across his chest now appeared wilted, crushed, as if twisted by restless hands. Frederick swore the pupils of Thomas's eyes now shone faintly beneath their lids, as though watching from behind closed skin. The sound accompanied it always. Scratching, sometimes faint as moth wings, sometimes loud enough to drown the silence of the house. It came from the walls, the floors, the very earth outside. At night, Frederick pressed his ear to the photograph and heard it most clearly. Nails raking wood, gasps of thin breath, the slow suffocation of dirt pressing closer. The torment left him with only one thought. He had to know. The photograph was a mirror, yes, but a mirror of what? Could it be imagination? Hallucination? Or was Thomas still down there, beneath 6 feet of cold earth, his body locked in an endless prison of poison and soil? The idea festered until it was unbearable. On April 14th, under a moonless sky, Frederick took a spade and lantern and crept to the graveyard. The earth was still damp with thaw, heavy and black. Each thrust of the spade was agony. Back bent, sweat dripping, lungs burning. But the scratching in his ears drove him onward, urged him deeper. The photograph hung inside his coat, burning against his chest like a second heart. Hours passed. The mound shrank. And then, thud, the dull, hollow strike of wood beneath metal. His BR. The lid split with a splintering groan, the sound tearing through the cemetery like a scream. Frederick's lantern shook in his trembling hand as he forced the boards wide. The smell struck first, a suffocating wave of damp earth, rot, and something sharper, chemical, as though his own concoctions still clung to the body. Then came the sight. Thomas did not lie in repose as he had been placed. His once folded hands were twisted upward, fingers curled into claws. His face, once serene, was contorted, jaw stretched open, lips peeled back as if frozen in a final gasp for air. The coffin lining was shredded, long grooves raked deep into the pine where his nails had torn at it. Even in death, his fingertips were cracked, the flesh raw from the struggle. Frederick staggered back, nearly dropping the lantern. Every scratch in the coffin matched the marks on the photograph. What the camera had captured faintly, the truth now revealed in full, savage relief. His brother had lived, had suffered, had fought the darkness until his body finally betrayed him. And then Frederick saw something worse. Pinned between Thomas's rigid fingers was a fragment of fabric, not from the coffin lining, but from a sleeve. White cotton, frayed at the edges. His own. Somehow, in those final moments, Thomas had clutched at him, as though reaching for help, as though begging for salvation even as the dirt fell. The physician collapsed to his knees, a sound bursting from him that was neither sob nor scream, but something broken, animal. His lantern clattered against the earth, throwing shadows that danced across the twisted corpse. For the first time, he admitted aloud what his mind had circled for weeks. I buried him alive. The graveyard swallowed the words. The headstones loomed like silent judges. And still the photograph, tucked in his coat, seemed to pulse against his chest, an image of Thomas alive, accusing, eternal. Frederick fell forward, clutching his brother's ruined body, the rot SD. The house on Elm Street became a tomb long before Frederick ever joined his brother beneath the soil. He locked the photograph away at first, shoving it into his medical journal, convinced that if he could not see it, it could not see him. But silence has a way of amplifying guilt. The scratching he thought he buried with Thomas followed him home. At first, faint, the kind of sound one might mistake for mice behind the walls. But no matter where he sat, no matter how loud the lamps hissed, no matter how tight he pressed his palms over his ears, the sound was there. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The pattern was deliberate, not the chaos of rodents, but the rhythm of nails clawing at wood. The rhythm of survival turned despair. And then the voice came, whispering through the boards, threading itself into the hum of the night air. Thomas's voice, raspy, weak, yet undeniable. "Brother, help me. Brother, wake me." Frederick froze each time it spoke, as if the words reached out and gripped him by the spine. He would stagger to the journal, open it, and stare at the photograph until dawn. And in the flickering lamplight, Thomas's expression seemed to shift, his eyelids fluttering, the corners of his mouth twitching, as though the daguerreotype itself were alive, replaying the last moments of the grave. He stopped accepting patience. He stopped eating. He stopped leaving the house altogether. The people of Millbrook whispered that Dr. Copeland was mourning too deeply, but grief alone cannot explain why shutters were nailed shut in broad daylight, or why neighbors reported hearing muffled screams at night, only for Frederick to insist they had imagined it. He had convinced himself of a terrible truth, that Thomas had not died at all, but lingered between life and death, trapped by Frederick's own hand in some liminal state. The experiment had not killed him. It had imprisoned him. Sleep brought no relief. In his dreams, the coffin lid slammed down again and again, and Thomas's. By the spring of 1861, Frederick was no longer a physician in any meaningful sense. The instruments in his laboratory, once meant for cures, had become tools for invocation. Scalpel and mortar, flask and crucible, each bore the residue of experiments that no medical board would ever sanction. He had abandoned his patients, but not his practice. No, Frederick still practiced. Only now, his patient was a ghost. He became convinced Thomas was neither fully dead nor fully alive, that his brother existed in what ancient texts once called the third state. Not heaven, not hell, but an in-between realm where the body rots while the spirit claws desperately to remain tethered. Frederick's obsession with saving Thomas warped into something darker. If he could not cure him, perhaps he could summon him back. His journals from this period, later uncovered in the hidden compartment of the medical society, are no longer written in the clear hand of a physician. They are fevered, sprawling, as though penned in a trance. Among the notes on alkaloids and nerve responses appear words in Latin, Greek, even Hebrew, lines copied from grimoires and half-burned pages sent secretly across the Atlantic. He began to speak of the boundary, as if it were a physical membrane he could tear open with the right combination of chemicals, chance, and sacrifice. Neighbors noticed strange smells drifting from the house, acrid smoke of burning herbs, the metallic tang of blood, the rot of unwashed flesh. Children swore they saw lights flickering in the basement windows long past midnight, green and violet, unnatural hues that no lantern could produce. Frederick himself grew gaunt, hollow-eyed, speaking less to men than to shadows. He arranged bottles of Thomas's preserved hair and fingernails in precise geometric patterns, convinced they formed keys to unlock the barrier between the living and the dead. He fasted for days, claiming it sharpened his mind to hear his brother's voice more clearly. And on the night of June 9th, 1861, Frederick crossed the final threshold. He had prepared for weeks, arranging every tool, every substance, every relic of his brother in meticulous order. The laboratory was no longer a doctor's basement. It was a shrine, a chamber of invocation. On the floor, he had chalked a circle, symbols copied from forbidden texts mailed secretly from Europe. At its center lay the photograph of Thomas, propped upright like an idol. Around it, hair, teeth, fingernail clippings, bits of stained fabric, all scavenged from his brother's belongings, from his grave. He wrote in his journal, "Tonight, I call him back. If heaven denies him and hell cannot claim him, then I will anchor him here." The ritual began with fire. He burned belladonna, hemlock, and the cursed rye fungus that had sparked this tragedy, their smoke filling the air until the room swam with visions. He slashed his palm with a scalpel and let his blood drip into a basin, whispering Thomas's name with each drop. He drank a tincture of his own making, half sedative, half poison, to blur the edge of consciousness and make himself, as he wrote, a door. And then the scratching began again. Not faint, not imagined. It echoed from the walls, the floorboards, even the ceiling. Every direction at once. The photograph vibrated where it stood, the image of Thomas flickering, as if the emulsion itself could not contain him. Frederick staggered forward, chanting his brother's name through blood-slick lips. The light went out. Not the lamps, not the fire, all light. The air thickened, pressing against his chest like soil. In that suffocating dark, a shape began to emerge within the circle. Bent, crooked, with hands like claws raking across the floor. "Thomas," Frederick whispered, "I brought you back." But the figure that rose was not his brother. Its head turned too far. Its eyes were voids, its mouth a wound that stretched beyond human anatomy. And when it spoke, the voice was layered, not on. The Copeland house never truly burned. Its walls blackened, its windows shattered, but the foundation stood, scarred and empty, like a warning. The townspeople refused to enter. They whispered of sounds in the ruins at night. Voices, footsteps, even the faint scratching of nails against stone. For years, children dared one another to peer through the broken cellar door. None lasted long. They always came running, pale and wide-eyed, swearing something had looked back. Frederick's disappearance became an unsolved mystery. Some claimed he fled, overcome with grief and scandal. Others swore they saw him wandering the cemetery at dusk, digging with his bare hands. But the truth did not surface until a century later, in 1963, when the Boston Medical Society underwent renovations. Behind a false wall in the archives, workers uncovered a hidden compartment. Inside, Frederick's journals, his correspondence with European physicians, and most damning of all, the daguerreotypes. Not one, but dozens, each depicting not only Thomas, but other men, women, even children, subjects Frederick had photographed under the guise of medical research. And on every photograph, faint but unmistakable, the scratches. Some were barely visible, others furious gouges that tore the emulsion to ribbons. The implication was clear. Thomas had not been the only one. Historians tried to dismiss it as chemical error, deterioration of early photographic plates. But the scratches were too precise, too deliberate, too consistent across decades and continents. And among Frederick's papers were letters from physicians in Paris, Prague, and even London, all describing the same phenomena. Patients given experimental sedatives, declared dead, buried hastily. Photographs developing with marks as if the subjects had clawed at them from within. This was not coincidence. It was a pattern, a network of men, highly educated, publicly respected, privately obsessed with probing the veil between life and death. You follow me this far, deeper than most men dare go. You've heard the story of Frederick Copeland, of the brother buried alive, of photographs that claw back from the grave. But here's the part they never teach, the part men spend their entire lives refusing to face. This was never about one doctor, one town, one tragic mistake. This is about you, about the world you live in, and the invisible hands that built it. Think carefully. How many institutions claim authority over life and death today? How many men in white coats still experiment behind locked doors, guarded by the same excuse Frederick used, for progress, for knowledge, for the greater good? How many times in history have we been told someone died peacefully when the evidence says otherwise? You were raised to trust the official story, to accept the surface, to believe what the photograph shows. But photographs lie. Journals lie. Institutions lie. The truth scratches at the edges of every surface. And once you've seen it, once you've heard it, you can never go back. You're marked. You're awake. That's why the scratching never stops. It's not just Frederick's torment. It's a reminder that they buried the truth alive, and it still wants out. So here's what I ask of you. A pact. A mark. If you've heard me clearly, if you understand what this story really means, then write this phrase twice in the comments and never forget it. I hear the scratching. Not once. Twice. Because repetition is ritual. because men like Frederick believed repeating an act could force the veil open. And here, we'll use the same principle to tear open the algorithm, to drag this knowledge into the light. The phrase is not just a comment. It's a signal, a symbol to yourself and to others that you are not blind, not asleep, not chained to the official version of events. Write it twice, and the scratching becomes yours. Write it twice, and you carry the mark into the digital graveyard where the truth is buried beneath endless. You feel it now, don't you? The scratching isn't just in Frederick's grave or in the walls of his house. It's in the walls of your own life. The Copeland tragedy wasn't an isolated horror of the 19th century. It was a prototype, a template, a rehearsal for the systems that would follow. Think about it. In Frederick's time, the experiment was crude, chemical paralysis, premature burial, photographs that whispered of what had been done. Today, the experiment is cleaner, quieter, sanctioned by laws and institutions. Bodies aren't just buried alive. Minds are. Men are sedated with screens, fed curated images and official narratives, lulled into a waking coma where their instincts rot, but their bodies still walk. Look at the language. Pacified, stabilized, controlled. They don't even hide it anymore. The same pattern repeats. Hidden rooms, secret journals, knowledge walled off from public view. Then photographs, media, images presented as truth while the real story scratches just beyond the frame. And when someone starts to dig, when they claw at the coffin lid of the official story, they're dismissed as unstable, dangerous, obsessed, just as Frederick was, just as you may be feeling right now. The Copeland papers reveal letters from men in Europe who spoke of the boundary, as if it were a frontier, something to be pushed, crossed, harvested. They weren't just talking about death, they were talking about control. If you can suspend a man between life and death, you own him. If you can suspend a society between truth and lie, you rule it. That's the experiment. That's the ritual still playing out around you every day. But here's the secret Frederick never understood. The real veil isn't between life and death. It's between awareness and sleep. Between the man who accepts the photograph and the man who sees the scratches. Between the buried and the digger. And every time you notice, every time you question, you move closer to breaking through. That's why you're here. This is where the story was always heading. Frederick thought he was summoning his brother back. What he really summoned was the truth about himself. He wasn't a healer. He was a jailer. He didn't save Thomas. He trapped him. And in the end, he was dragged into the very space he'd created. The journals end abruptly. The scratches do not. They keep appearing on the walls of the Copeland house, in the photographs, even in the digital scans uploaded by archivists 150 years later. The mark is not chemical. It moves from medium to medium. Paper, plate, film, screen. It's an idea that behaves like a contagion. The more you look at it, the clearer it gets. The more you try to explain it, the deeper it hooks. You've already felt it. You've followed the thread through grief, science, ritual, conspiracy. You've seen how the pattern replicates, how a society can sedate, bury, and keep its subjects between states. That's the real experiment, and you're living in it. But here's where the story splits. This isn't a spell. There's no actual curse at work. It's a metaphor, a way of describing something our culture prefers to keep unnamed, the experience of being half alive in systems that want you numb. The scratching you hear isn't a ghost. It's your own instincts clawing at the lid. Frederick's mistake was believing he could open the door and stay in control. You don't need to repeat his ritual. You don't need blood, circles, or chants. All you need is to see, to remember, to keep asking who benefits when you're asleep and what happens when you wake up. That's the real act of resurrection. So, when you leave this story, leave it knowing that nothing supernatural has been transferred to you. The only thing that's real is the knowledge that systems can bury people alive, physically once, mentally now. And the only mark worth carrying is the decision not to be buried. That's the ending. Not a curse. A choice. A door left open, but this time it's you.